We're in our series, Light of the World. We talked about Jesus last week coming in and being the light of the world. We took it from the story of the Gospel of John last week. And so today I'm asking everybody in the audience to re-engage a little bit to wherever you may be in life. How many of you know we've been talking about that a little bit this morning, but it's so easy to disengage from the Christian walk sometimes because of busyness, because of things that happen in our lives. Some of you have been hurt in church. Maybe you've been hurt in church. Maybe you have something has happened and you've been pushed away. You've had a bad experience. Maybe you met somebody or didn't meet somebody and you walked away because of those reasons. Or maybe you had some kind of dramatic thing happen in your life, and for some reason or another, you sort of let what used to be so bold in your life, the love of Christ so bold in your life, sort of just fade dim. But you're here this morning, but there's something that keeps drawing you back. And let me just tell you, the thing that keeps drawing you back is that light of the world. It's that spark that won't go away, because you knew at one time in your life, you knew at some point in your life, that spark that changed your life forever at those moments when you gave your heart to Christ. That same spark is still inside of you. You're like, man, if I could ever get back to the way I felt then, all things would be okay. So I'm asking that you would re-engage your heart today. No matter where you've been, no matter what situation or what you're going through, I'm asking that you would re-engage your heart. So this morning, as we're getting going, I know some of you are excited about this one. I told you last week about what my message was everyone has a little bit of Herod in them. Some of you weren't so happy with that title. But it is the truth. Every one of us have a little bit of Herod in us. If we want to or not, you're thinking, not me. I don't have any of King Herod in me. I'm perfect. You listen the most this morning. I'd like you to tell the story of the person that most closely identify sometimes. The Christmas story, sometimes his name is Herod, and sometimes you identify him, but sometimes in our lives we identify him more than what we'd like. Herod was a king. How many of you ever wanted to be king? Or how many of you ever wanted to be queen? Yeah, some of you are thinking about that. How many of you just wanted to marry a king? And then you got married and you're like, trash. How many of you thought you were marrying a queen? You thought you were marrying a queen? Oh, I just want to make sure. And then you got home and you realized that she was king. Yeah, by the way, she's at her uncle's funeral, by the way, so she wouldn't be here this morning. Yeah, I can say what I want. I'm free. Yes, she's probably watching it. But some of us want to be king, some of us want to be queen. Sometimes we want to marry a king or queen, but sometimes we just want to do what we want. How many of you just sometimes, can we all just be transparent here a little bit? How many of you, sometimes you get to be where you do things for others so much that there's just something that sort of snaps in you saying, you know what, not no more, I'm doing what I want. I'm tired of everybody else doing stuff. I'm tired of taking everybody else. I'm tired of serving everybody else. I'm just going to do what I want. Anybody have that little click button that happens sometimes? And then you do what you want for about a month, 2 months, then you realize, what am I doing? I'm not even a Christian anymore. Herod. Do what you want when you want to do it. That's the big part. Do what you want when you want to do it. I love people say, I'm going to do what I want when I want to do it. That's exciting people to be around. How many of you know somebody like that? How many of you know somebody who knows you, who knows somebody that knows that? I'm never going to gain any more weight. That's not a profession. You never want to get old. How many know you can't control that? Never going to die. How many know you can't control that? And we want God to help us. How many of you want God to help us? But we don't want him to compete with us. Let me say that one again. We all want God's help, but we don't want to compete with God. You there? How many of you know when our wills don't line up with his will, we're not asking for help anymore, we're competing with? So Herod, we pick up the story a little bit. Herod was the client king over Judea. He was smart. He was talented. Herod was smart. He was talented. He was bold and courageous in the time. If you've ever read about Herod, as I was studying for this message, he oversaw building projects. Man, he built a great kingdom. Man, if you ever see what Herod accomplished during his time as king, it was amazing. He did some great things. He oversaw building projects. He rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, he was known for some stuff. Herod's goal was eternal fame. He wanted to establish a lineage as king of Israel. He wanted to be known forever as king over Israel. So let me just tell you a couple of things. My favorite Herod story, as I was studying all this kind of stuff, I just want to tell a little bit. Herod knew he ruled at the pleasure of Rome. How many of you know the Romans were actually in charge of everything that was happening in that area? But he was ruling in the pleasure. Everybody put Herod there because he could get things done. So he was ruling in the pleasure of Rome. So he did everything he could to keep his masters happy. Y'all with me? After the murder of Julius Caesar, I'm just going to give you a little history here. In 44 BC, his nephew Octavian, who would become Caesar Augustus, and Mark Antony became tracking down and killing those responsible for Caesar's murder. Eventually, they became two power brokers in the empire. Herod was in the habit of sending lavish presents to Mark Antony and to his mistress, the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. He wrongly assumed that in the end, Mark Antony would become the number one man in Rome. But civil war broke out in 31 BC. It was short. In August, Octavian defeated the eastern leader who fled to Alexandria in Egypt. Herod had aligned himself with a loser. He had already seen how Octavian dealt with his political enemies. Herod wanted to hang out into his kingdom. He made a very bold decision. This is what Herod did. He made a very bold decision. Instead of fleeing to Egypt or preparing for war with Octavian, he sailed to the island of Rhodes, where he met Octavian. In a brilliant speech, Herod boasted of his loyalty to Mark Antony and promised the same to the new master of the Roman Empire. Octavian was impressed by the man's audacity and confirmed Herod's monarchy, even adding the coast of Judea, Samaria, Jericho, and Gaza, which had been independent to his realm. He was very ambitious. Herod was very ambitious about everything. In the midst of what he thought was going to be taken away from him, he actually went with all confidence and wanted to get in close with everybody else because he wanted to, again, set up a kingdom for himself, a lineage, and he wanted to be known as the king of Israel. So let's talk a little bit more about Herod's ambition and how it controlled him. Herod had 10 wives and several sons. How many of you like to have 10 wives? Hey, can I ask y'all a question? I asked this question the other day. This is totally off my message. In polygamy, is it just the man that can have more wives, or can the woman have more husbands? That just seems weird to me. I just don't know how the women put up with that. I just be honest with you. That's totally off point. You can be thinking about it later. But I'm just asking. I just didn't know how that worked. Asking for a friend. Yeah. He had 10 wives and several sons, one of which he planned to establish the king. But he kept changing his mind 4 times. He kept saying, hey, look, I'm going to make you king. But 4 times he changed his mind. Because he was wondering if his kingdom was going to outlast him. He was so worried about his kingdom, about what he had built and everything else. He wanted his name to last forever. He was consumed with trying to control the future. He wanted to control his kingdom from the grave, protecting his name, but trying to control chaos resulted in even more chaos. Have you ever tried to control chaos? She is in control. You're going to get in trouble, Tim. But trying to control chaos resulted in more chaos. He decided against his sons Aristobulus and Antipater, you can say that however you want to, that's how I chose to say it, who were executed in 7 and 4 BC. Why were they executed? So they wouldn't be king. He killed his own sons, causing the emperor of Augustus to joke that it was preferable to be Herod's pig than his sons, because he wanted to control what was happening in his life. As we get going a little bit more, he said Herod was 70 when he became sick from a painful kidney disease. How many of you did anybody know that? Yeah, I didn't know that either until I started reading this story. And as he was getting through some of this kind of stuff, he also had a lot of other things happen. Hold on, I'm trying to find one other piece of information I had here. But he had a painful kidney disease that he had done through all this kind of stuff, and he had his sons executed because he did not want them to be king over anything. And so after all this, his ambition, he started to look to see what he could do to keep control of his kingdom. And thus the Magi actually came to what was happening in his life at the time. And they came to him and talked to him about, after all he had done to keep his kingdom, the Magi had actually came and they told him the story about what? A what? A baby. He talked to him about everything that had happened with a baby that was going to be born, that was going to come, and he was going to be king of the Jews. And Herod thought to himself, that cannot happen. He cannot come and take my place. And so he thought about everything he could do at the moment that he could make sure that wasn't going to happen. And so let's start reading the bad news that Herod received. In Matthew 2, 1 through 14. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who had been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. The Magi, they studied the stars. They knew that it was time. They knew that they had seen that and what was happening. And when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. This was personal to King Herod. When he found out that somebody else was going to take his glory, that somebody else was going to take his power, somebody else was going to take his prestige, he had already made up things. He said, I'm going to fix this. The Jews already had a king. I will choose the next one. He was wanting to be in control. Herod had been made king over of the Jews and was at that very moment making plans for a successor. And he couldn't believe that another king had been born. What was this that was happening at this very moment? And so let's go to verse 4. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. Isn't it funny that the so-called king of the Jews had to ask about the king of the Jews? Because he did not even know. In verse 5, it says, in Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Verse 7. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for this child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I may go up and worship him. Verse 9. After they had heard the king, when they went up on their way, and the star that they had seen where it rose and went ahead of them until it stopped over a place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. And coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. They came from miles away to worship. They gave gifts. They followed the light. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and they left for Egypt. And so the story continues in verse 16. And it says, when Herod realized that they had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. See, he had spent his whole life controlling outcomes. We talked about in our Wednesday night class this last week, and there's some things we even talked about last week, but you cannot control what. One of them was people. What was the other one? You cannot control situations, and what's the other one? Sometimes we can't control ourselves. But when you've been working your whole life to try to control everything around you, trying to control situations and the outcome of how every situation's going to turn out, when you've tried to do that your whole life, and when it doesn't go your plan, it doesn't go your way, then we get so upset, we get so mad because we're like, well, I don't have any control over my life. How many know when you give your life to Christ, you don't really have to worry about that anymore? The most time that I've ever get in trouble in my life was when I can try to control the outcome of it without Christ. Now, one time did it say that Herod ever looked to Christ. He didn't even know the scriptures of where to find the King of Kings. He never did look to the scriptures. He didn't even know. He had to ask the Magi about it. He had never sought counsel. He had already made plans about the way his life was going to turn out. He'd already made plans. And he thought to himself, this baby is not going to mess things up for me. Herod, in this midst, we all know what happened in this story. So he gave an order to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. That last year, that same year that he gave the order, Herod died a painful death. He had a kidney issue, and he died a painful death, and he attempted suicide, but was stopped by a cousin. And all of that because he was trying to control what he couldn't control. Talked to you a little bit. The guy who, Josephus, if you study this history, he said Josephus stated that Herod was so concerned that no one would mourn his death that he commanded a large group of distinguished men to come to Jericho, and he gave an order they should be killed at the time of his death. So the displays of grief that now listen to this story. He was so worried that nobody was going to cry for him at his own funeral, that he had a whole bunch of distinguished men, and he brought them in, and he had all of those men killed. So a lot of people would mourn their funeral, so it looked like they were mourning for him. He had other men killed, so it looked like their mourners were actually mourning his death. He was so worried about what people were going to think about him and how his life was going to end. That's pretty crazy. It's pretty demented. So let's get going. I am going to preach a little bit this morning. Hang on. Herod became let's finish the story. Verse 19, after Herod died, the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead. Herod became a footnote in a toddler's story. In an instant, Herod, the great, became a footnote in the story of Jesus, the toddler king. Imagine explaining that to him all the plans and all the sacrifices you've made to preserve your own legacy and independence were gone. They were all thwarted by a toddler. Herod every year planned. People all over the world would read your name, but not in reference to your story or your son's history. The temple you built, the magnificent, everything that Herod had built, everything had went. We read about it in history, but that's not what they would remember. What they would remember was the crazy way he acted, trying to keep his own conscience, the killing of his own sons, and all the things that had happened in the midst of it. But we read this story just of him trying to kill Jesus even in the middle of when he was a baby. The world would remember you as the king who attempted to resist, to extinguish the light of the world. 8 years later, Herod was long gone. Jesus said, Herod was long gone. And we see that all these kind of things that happened, and Jesus' kingdom was coming in. We see Jesus working and doing the miracles and all the things that had happened, and all the things that had happened even in the story, and the temple had been destroyed, and all his legacy, everything that Herod had tried to hold together had been destroyed. Let's go to John 1, 4 and 5. We read this last week, and then I'm going to finish up this morning. It says, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The whole thing that Herod was trying to do is he was trying to make his own kingdom. He was trying to let it shine and be bright. And instead of all this, the true light of the world, the true king of Israel had come in. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So let me ask you this story this question as I'm closing is, in the midst of all the things that people will remember about you in your life, is it about what all you've done, what all that you've accomplished, what all the things that you have went through, the things that you have tried to, you have chaos in your life, you're trying to control chaos, and it leads to more chaos. When everybody at the end of your life is done, what will they remember about you? What will they say about you? Will you have a story when your family is getting around talking about it, at your funeral or all the things? You're like, man, why are you talking about funerals? Because this is what happens at funerals. If you've been to one lately, people talk about all the things that have happened and all the things that you did and all these kind of things. What will they talk in the midst of each other? Will it be about the kingdom that you try to build, all the things that you try to do, or will it be that you participated in his kingdom? That you made a difference in his kingdom, that you weren't so worried about building your own kingdom, that you helped build his kingdom? Will you have clung to what you would eventually be taken away or surrendered and allow God to do something bigger than you? How many of you know that when we try to do things in our own life, it's only going to be a small portion, but if we'll partner with God, it'll be on a larger scale like we've never, ever thought about before. The Magi who brought the gifts, they brought the treasures to the boy Jesus. They had it right. They were already great men. They were already wise men. They were already people who had done things. But when we read their story, when we read the Magi's story, what do you remember about them? Come on, that was actually a question. What do you remember about them? Do we talk about how great they were? Or do we talk about how they came and they worshiped the King? How do you want to be remembered in history? How do you want people to think about you in history? Were you so worried about preserving your legacy that you forgot to let his legacy rule in your life? And all the things that we get into, we ask that question. I asked you before, do you have plans of your life, or are you competing with his plans? Isn't it sad that the true king of the Jews that could have come in, and if Herod, he was 5 miles from the King of Kings. He was 5 miles. He could have made the short trek and went and worshiped. It could have totally changed his outlook on life. He would have realized, hey, I don't have to keep fighting for the things that I want in my life. If he would have just surrendered. He was 5 miles from the light of the world. Yet he couldn't see it. He couldn't see the light of the world because he was everything in his own life had eclipsed it. He was so worried about what was going to happen to him, what he was going to do, and how people were going to remember him. Imagine if he would have surrendered. How would this story have changed if the king, or so-called the king of the Jews at that moment, would have came and worshiped the King of Kings? How his story would have been so much changed, and how our story of how we'd have remembered him would have been so changed. Always, I wanted to finish with this little thing too. I've said this in my Wednesday night class, and we've talked about it a little bit before, but it's amazing how small decisions based on our legacy can make everything new, or can make everything change. Throughout the Bible, we always read the story of how that it says that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and who? And who? But because of a decision that Esau made, it doesn't read the way that Esau had planned it. It should have read Abraham, Isaac, and Esau. He was the firstborn. But he had made some choices in his life, and because of that, he is now Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's amazing that the choices that we make in life are so important, and they can change or alter the way that our lives go. And we have to be so careful that in the midst of all the things that are happening, that Jesus, even though that when we read him in this story, he was a baby that came to earth, and Herod saw that, and he became a threat. How many of you know that sometimes in our lives we forget that Jesus is not threatening us? But we feel like if we have to give our rights to our life, if we have to surrender our life to him, that everything's going to change and we won't have any more control over our own life. Let me just tell you that Jesus is not a threat to you. He wants to let you change, and he wants to bless you because of him. So this morning I asked this simple question. I know I read a little bit of history this morning. I'm asking you this morning, that light, that little light that we talked about at the beginning of my message this morning, the reason that you may be here this morning, maybe it's just a small light is because you have let everything else in this world sort of try to put it out, try to extinguish what God has placed inside of you. I'm asking you to re-engage a little bit this morning. I'm asking that you would put your kingdom away this morning, and you say, God, I surrender my life one more time. I'm wanting the light of the world to take every part of my life. I'm asking you to shine on every part of my life. I'm not worried about my own kingdom. I'm not worried about all the things that I want to do in life, but I want to surrender my life and say, God, whatever you have planned, whatever you want to do. There's some teenagers in this room right now. You're trying to plan out your future. And you got your own life planned out of what you think is going to happen and what you want to do. I'm asking, will you surrender your life and say, God, I'm tired of fighting against you. I'm tired of competing with you. I'm tired of competing with your plans. I want to partner with you. You'll be amazed as when you recognize that in your life, when God does that in your life, how things will change. Will everybody bow your head and close your eyes today?